Our last presentation is by the Indian River County Health Department on trap, neuter, vaccinate, and release, known as TNVR. And good morning, Miranda. Welcome.
Good morning, and thank you very much for having me here this morning. And we really wanted to take the opportunity because there's been a lot of stories in the media, well, not a lot, but a few, about the issues regarding free-roaming cats. And I wanted to talk a little bit about our public health concerns regarding those cats. We have information specific to our county that we're going to discuss. Our GIS department has helped us tremendously. They really are fantastic. I'd just like to compliment them to start out. When we use the term free roaming, it's because we need to include not only those stray and feral cats, meaning those that grew up in the wild, but also owned animals that spend time outside unattended. For the purposes of this presentation, we'll call them outdoor cats. So all of you probably recall this past May, we had a rabies alert. And what I want to tell you the backstory to that rabies alert. We had an open feeding within 300 feet of a rabid cat attack. We had attempted repeatedly to cite the person doing the feeding 4 months prior, and that person refused to pick up the certified mail for the notice to correct. We hand served that notice after the attack. Our entire presentation is referenced. If you'd like the original articles, we certainly can provide them. I also have members of our staff here, Cheryl Dunn, who's our environmental health manager, Charles Vogt, environmental specialist that's over many of the investigations that we do in terms of open feeding and sanitary nuisance, as well as Dr. Barb Pergulski, who's specialty board certified in veterinary preventive medicine. So when we talk about numbers, how many are there? The estimates on this slide are from papers from the early 2000s. There's currently an effort in Washington, D.C. to count the number of feral cats in a study, and that'll likely inform these estimates better in the future, but the numbers that I've got on the screen are probably low. So it's estimated there are at least 38,000 pet cats in Indian River County, and 66% of those owned cats spend time outdoors, and that equates to about 25,000 cats, pet cats, spending time outside in our county. In 2004, researchers estimated there's about 1 feral cat per every 2 households in a community, and that equates to over 30,000 in Indian River County. So when you add those two numbers together, it equates to over 55,000 outdoor cats right here in Indian River. And using those calculations, there are 107 million outdoor cats in the United States. As you know, well, maybe you didn't know, but in public health, we pay an awful lot of attention to this. We've had 2 rabies deaths in the state of Florida in October 2017 and January 2018. Prior to this, we had not had a rabies death in 60 years in the state of Florida. And the last rabies death in our state in 1948 was from dog rabies, a bite from a neighbor's dog, and the victim refused treatment. And this is what we worry about, that people minimize their interactions with wildlife and they won't pay attention to that bite or a scratch, and it is a life or death situation. It can be. We frequently see rabid outdoor cats due to outside feeding and commingling with raccoons. And here are a few recent examples from the news that you can see up on the screen. Santa Rosa County had a rabid cat in February 2018. Hillsborough County has had rabid cats in February, March, 2 in June, August 21st and 28th roughly, and they had 6 rabid cats so far this year, and that is unprecedented. Clay County had a rabid cat in September 2018. Ours was in May here in Indian River, and Brevard had 2, one in August and 1 in September in the same area, and there have just been 2 in Miami-Dade. 15 cats so far year to date have been rabid in the state of Florida. Last year, to give you a perspective, there were 8. Now, I can tell you in Hillsborough County, there have been a number of news articles, if you care to reference. Target 8's done a lot of investigative stories that can give you the perspective from that community, but I'm not going to go over that today. I did want to talk about animal rabies in Indian River County by species in the last 10.5 years. So both for the CDC nationally and the state of Florida, cats represent the majority of rabid domestic animals since 1992. So when you look at our last 10 and a half years of data, we tested 44 raccoons, 14% were positive for rabies. We tested 14 bats, 29% were positive for rabies. And of cats, we tested 90 cats, 3% of those were tested positive for rabies. And the issue with cats, they're a domestic species, so many of those animals that are wandering are not necessarily afraid of people, but they still are subject to the same risks because they're outdoor cats. But when you look year to date, July 2018, we've tested 6 raccoons with no positives, 2 bats with 2 positives, and 11 cats so far tested in 18 with 1 positive, and that equates to 9% of those cats positive. I also want you to notice that we've had 4 rabid cats and 4 rabid bats in the last 10 and a half years. So people oftentimes think of bats as a risk, but they don't always think of cats. And that's what we're concerned about in terms of public health. I do want to tell you this is not an estimate of prevalence. We only test animals if they've exposed humans or pets. Cats are a domestic animal, and as I said, people have more interaction with those cats than wild animals. Dog rabies around the world is still responsible for 99% of human rabies cases. However, when you look at the United States, canine rabies has been eliminated due to mandatory rabies vaccination and licensing requirements for dogs. It used to be in the 60s and 70s that people let their dogs roam outside. They didn't think anything of just opening the back door and letting them roam. But now, people would be horrified at that happening. In terms of outdoor cats, they can be a source of other diseases transmitted to people. When you have a congregation of cats that don't receive routine veterinary care like vaccination and deworming, it increases the risk of transmitting disease, not only to the cats, but to other wildlife species and humans. I wanted to talk about a few of those diseases, and there are others, but these are the ones I'm going to highlight. And I know that you may be sensitive to the picture on the screen, so I'll talk about that too. Toxoplasmosis, cats are the only natural host for that disease. The majority of human infections are from exposure to oocysts and feces, so cat poop. Cat feces, where they like to defecate, is in soft sandy soil, like the beaches, like sandboxes, or in areas like gardens with soft soil. Toxoplasmosis is usually dormant in healthy people, but when the immune system wanes, that's when you can see the infection reactivate. Toxoplasma oocysts can persist in the environment for 12 to 18 months. Oops, I'm sorry. Cat bites, they're less prevalent than dog bites, but those infections from cat bites can be more severe. The primary demographic is the bite to the hand as well as to middle-aged women. Now, the picture that you have on the lower right of the screen is from hookworm. So 75% of feral cats were positive in a Florida study. Exposure is through fecal eggs that mature to an infectious larval stage in the environment, and the larvae actually penetrate the skin in direct contact with the infected environment. In many cases, it's on beaches. These parasites stay trapped in the skin but slowly migrate, and that's what you can see on that person's foot, and that's from the Department of Health at Miami-Dade, and can cause scarring in some cases. Cat scratch disease is one of the more common zoonotic diseases. It's transmitted among cats via fleas, and the exposure to people is through bites, scratches, and saliva contact with open wounds, and a common cause of enlarged lymph nodes. There are other diseases. Murine typhus is an outbreak that's currently going on in LA County, but I'm not going to talk about that, but that has been linked to cats there. Toxoplasmosis, I've already talked about. It's only found in cat feces. The spread is from cat to human. It's also foodborne. It can be transmitted from mother to child in utero. 11% of the population 6 years and older has been infected with toxoplasma. That's much higher in other parts of the world. It can be as high as 30%. When you look at issues of sanitation and food hygiene. And the other piece, because you need to understand how this is happening, an adult cat can produce 32 pounds of feces per year. Toxoplasmosis is considered the leading cause of death attributed to foodborne illness in the United States. Over 30 million people in the United States carry the parasite. It can cause miscarriage, stillbirth, neurologic disease, eye disease that's sometimes diagnosed in adulthood, and that parasite reactivates when the person's immune suppressed. FAU actually found toxo in bottlenose dolphin in the lagoon in 2005. It showed on antibody titers. And the CDC also informs toxo is found in shellfish because they're filter feeders and it can be a foodborne source. This next slide, I'm going to talk about the picture on the left in just a minute. There was a hookworm outbreak in Pompano Beach in 2018. Many of you may have seen that on CNN. I mean, people like me pay attention to that. I mean, maybe not you so much, but we notice it in public health. The investigation's ongoing. 7 people were infected. We had outbreaks in Miami Beach in 2011. Their GIS department, and that's the picture on the left, actually mapped where the cats defecated and the feeding stations. So those red and green dots on the screen, that was part of a countywide effort to stem that outbreak. And so they had at least 15 people infected. It was linked to feral cats. Keep in mind that hookworm is not reportable. The prevalence is likely much higher. In 2007, there was a Miami Children's Camp outbreak. 4 staff and 18 campers were sickened. They traced the source of the infection to the sandbox, and 2 feral cats were trapped on the site. Feral cats are likely to have hookworms more than owned cats. All soil can't be disinfected and rid of potential pathogens. And just like when you had your meeting last week and you were talking about increased density of animals, feeding of cats results in that increased population density and increased parasite density, posing increased risk for the people and for the cats. So this picture that you see on the bottom is from MLK Plaza in Gifford, which is across from Gifford Middle School. And you can see the cats all around the dumpster. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more. There's open feeding going on at that location. When you've got the feeding of cats outside, it results in attraction and commingling with the main rabies carrier in our area and the entire eastern U.S., which is raccoons. Cats represent the majority of rabid domestic animals since 1992. Nationwide in 2015, cats of the rabid domestic animals were 58% of them, dogs were only 18%. And when you look at Florida over 20 years, raccoons were number 1, foxes were number 2, bats were number 3, 4 were cats, and bobcats were a distant number 5, and then dogs. Commissioner Zork, you had questions. I believe when we had the rabies alert, you were asking about the cost of prophylaxis, the cost of our investigations. So I pulled that for the last couple of years. You know, post-exposure treatment, keep in mind, it's rabies immune globulin plus vaccine on day 0, 3, 7, and 14. It's expensive. Just the vaccine alone is over $5,000. The 16-17 personnel cost for our agency was $17,011 based on follow-up to these investigations. Vaccine and rig cost was $39,614 for a total of $56,625. In 2017-2018, the personnel cost was $35,433, and the vaccine and rig was $31,912 for a total of $67,346, and that was our rabies alert. I wanted to talk a little bit about the mechanism when you have a high-risk animal rabies exposure. So free-roaming animals come in contact with that rabies high-risk wildlife, those raccoons. These encounters often involve fighting over food, both from intentional outdoor feeding and unintentional with dumpsters. Those free-roaming animals will shelter or fight for shelter with high-risk wildlife. And we don't see those exposures, and now those animals are potential vectors of rabies. So we have protocols that we have to follow from the CDC, from the National Association of Public Health Veterinarians, from the Florida Department of Health. So when an animal is vaccinated for rabies, you have to capture them, booster them for rabies, quarantine and observe them for 45 days. That's if an animal's already vaccinated. So when they're not vaccinated, you have to capture them, vaccinate for rabies, and quarantine for 120 days. And keep in mind, it's often difficult because these animals are trap shy. And so I know Chief Stone will be the first to tell you that when an animal is trapped, it's very difficult to trap them again, and that is a major concern for public health when we have these investigations. I'm going to talk about the situation at MLK Park. I'm sorry, MLK Plaza. So the basic idea when you talk about trap, neuter, release, trap, neuter, return, trap, neuter, vaccinate, release, there are several names for it. The basic idea is that an animal is trapped when someone will call to complain to animal control. An animal would be trapped, they'd be spayed or neutered, they'd be given one rabies vaccine and released back to the point at which that person first called. Please keep in mind that one vaccination for rabies does not confer immunity. The Florida Department of Health follows the Florida Rabies Advisory Committee and the Florida Rabies Compendium in terms of one rabies vaccination, a booster a year later, and then every 1 to 3 years based on manufacturer's direction. And oftentimes, these feral cats are immune suppressed because it's not a good environment for them outside. They're a domestic animal. As I had mentioned, other wildlife is attracted to feeding stations. We're concerned about rabies. We're concerned about that lack of routine veterinary care. It increases the likelihood of parasites and diseases like feline leukemia, feline distemper, feline infectious peritonitis, feline immunodeficiency virus, as well as zoonotic disease. TNVR is strongly promoted. Rarely are populations managed. It's ineffective in most situations based on you always are bringing more cats into that population. As you're feeding, you're attracting other animals, you're attracting other cats, you're attracting other wildlife. And from what we've read, several studies, that peer-reviewed science, estimated that you'd have to capture 71 to 94% of the population, assuming no immigration, that you'd have to spay or neuter 71 to 94% of our entire population that we have of cats that are feral outside to be able to decrease the population. And when you look at our numbers, that's 21,300 to 28,200 cats, and you'd have to keep that up. So the MLK cats, you can see that picture on the upper left, and that kitten that you see on the bottom was an intake at the Humane Society from Fellsmere. It had respiratory disease, and unfortunately that type of case is not uncommon. I wanted to talk a little bit about our open feeding complaints that we've had. We've issued 15 formal notices of violation to property owners since January 1st of this year. And open feeding constitutes a significant public health threat and is a violation of Florida Section 386.01, as well as Rule 68A-4 Florida Administrative Code. So you see that top picture on the left with the open feeding cans that are it's underneath a dilapidated house. Other people were coming in and doing that feeding. That house was actually occupied. The middle picture is from MLK Plaza across from Gifford Middle School. And these cats had been trapped before by TNVR advocates. It's exceedingly difficult to trap them again. We've trapped 5 of 9 cats. We can't trap the rest. Animal control has been working very hard to try to get that done, but once a cat is trapped, it's very difficult to trap them again, especially when they're being fed. It's a high-risk situation where raccoons have commingled with cats. We've trapped 3 or 4 raccoons there. There were also 3 or 4 kittens that were decomposed on the ground near the dumpster. The picture on the right was open feeding that was happening near a healthcare facility. In terms of the public health threats from sanitary nuisances, often when we have these open feeding, these areas also have sanitary nuisance conditions, and that perpetuates disease propagation, and that impacts adjacent property owners and the community. So these type of complaints include restaurants and also property owner complaints when there are activities next door or in an area impacting them or they have not consented to that activity. The site conditions that we see, and you can see that from the two pictures that are up on the screen, both rodent harborage, mosquito breeding, open feeding, and attracting animals. Unfortunately, the enforcement for corrective action often includes coordination between multiple agencies and lengthy litigation. The cases are time-consuming, complex, and consume scarce resources. And we see that open feeding, as you'll see in some of the maps that'll document what's going on in our county. We see open feeding in abandoned homes in vulnerable communities where people aren't going to complain because people are dealing with a whole lot of stresses. And when you add roaming animals, it's one more piece. So the maps that we're going to show captures by county or city animal control and law enforcement in our county 2010 to 2018 from intake data at the Humane Society. It's indicative of complaints and possible rabies exposures. Please keep in mind these are successful captures, not the number of complaints. And all of these points represent people that aren't here to complain, and there are more because these are only the successful captures. So you can see, and again, I wanted to thank the GIS department for putting this together for us because pictures really tell a story. This is a density map. I'm not going to go over the science behind it because I am not a GIS expert, but it's a kernel density map as I recall. But the hot zones, or the high density, are those areas in red. And it has a correlation to our most vulnerable areas in our county where people are already struggling, where we've got high poverty rates. It's troublesome. And you can see the rabies alert areas there on the lower right, as well as that call out with the general location of the rabies positive cat in May 2010 when we issued our rabies countywide alert. So this slide is from Gifford. You can see the vocational and technical college next door to Gifford Middle. They're outlined in the purple. Our most concentrated areas of cat captures over time is in Gifford. The little yellow circles mean 1 to 2 captures, triangles means 3 to 6, and diamonds mean 7 to 14. The red bulleted symbol means 15 to 30 captures. I do also want to draw attention on the lower right above 37th Street to East Gifford, as this is a small area but a very significant number of cats. As all of you know, and as you as the county and the Board of County Commissioners, we've all been working in our PCH projects in Gifford, and this is a significant concern for the people living in the Gifford community. I wanted to ask Tony Brown, who's our NAACP president, to come up and speak to the community impact.
Good morning, Commissioners. Tony Brown. Just looking at that picture, the old adage says a picture is worth 1,000 words. Looking at the picture, envision this being your neighborhood. Now absorb the reality that this is an area approximately 1.7 miles enclosed by 4 streets, north, south, east, and west. It's an impoverished, under-resourced, vulnerable community of color that already has a multitude of existing problems. The TNR does not solve the root problem. In this vulnerable community, how often would you think that someone who was scratched or bitten would report it? With all the other health factors, the poverty, and the vulnerability of that community. What happens when someone in this community gets rabies? It's a compacted, congested environment. You have medical problems, you have health issues, you have social and economic. To me, this is DEFCON 3 in a community such as Gifford. And I ask you again, look at it and envision it as it being your community. And how would you perceive the threat? Would it be major, would it be minor? 1.7 miles in a very vulnerable community. So this is what we as a community in Gifford have to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tony.
I wanted to show you some of the other maps. This is South County, and you can see when the the grids, you know, where the rabies alerts are marked, that shading in indicates that the rabies alert is on, it goes up that way, just for a point of reference. And the proximity of those cats to conservation lands. We have such a proliferation of cats in this area, and you can see our rabies alerts are also in this area. I do want to clarify, these are the rabies alerts for cats, not for any other animals. Historically, we also have rabies alerts for other animals. And when we issue a rabies alert, just so you know, that's dictated by the compendium. It tells us the conditions that we have to have to issue an alert. So Fellsmere still has many cats, not at the tremendous density level of our other hot zones, but still very significant. Our concern here is the number of cats in very populated areas and sensitive locations like schools. This is the central part of the county. On this slide, you see the large number of cats near Vero Beach High School, Freshman Learning Center, Vero Beach Elementary, and Rosewood Magnet. These were all within the boundaries of our recent rabies alerts. Again, I have significant concern in these areas that people, especially children, are not aware of the public health risks of outdoor cats. These schools are right in the middle, and kids are especially vulnerable. These captures in the north part of the county are near conservation areas in large numbers, which we suspect are associated with open feeding and ongoing abandonment. And this is the south part of Sebastian, as well as Wabasso. West Wabasso is another vulnerable community. We're consistently seeing the numbers near conservation areas. You can see those diamond areas down on the bottom part of the screen with large captures of cats. You can see the barrier island is limited. And what we suspect, although we don't have documentation of that, is that these cats are being relocated potentially, is what we suspect, but we don't have documentation of that. But what we do have in the central island, it's still limited for activity, but we have had businesses complain before on the beach side about cats impacting their business. So we want to talk about possible solutions. My intent is not to, in terms of public health, to demonize cats. My intent is to talk about protecting cats and protecting people. Because when you protect cats, you're protecting the public health. So this little picture on the screen is from a mobile home park in Gifford. This little kitten, when we took the picture, 2 other cats ran away from the kitten, but the kitten didn't move and was likely sick. So neither TNR or just removal solves the root problem. We have to look at policy changes and public education. We've got to prevent further abandonment. Because people, when they see a conglomeration of cats, they think, oh, my cat will be okay. I'll just put him at the side of the road with these other cats. We want to prevent that from happening. We want to educate feral cat feeders about the many problems associated with free-roaming cats. The problem is that these feral cat feeders are very secretive. And my concern is that at some point our luck's going to run out because they're going to be bitten or they're going to be scratched by an animal who has been exposed to rabies, and they won't report it. We want to strengthen ordinances addressing neutering, vaccination, registration, and free-roaming pets. And we want to properly fund animal control agencies and humane societies. I can tell you Chief Stone has been an amazing partner for the health department. He has ideas in terms of enhancing animal control. He's such a strong partner with us, and we appreciate that. Please keep in mind that domestic cats are not wild animals, and releasing them into the wild treats them as if they are. And when a cat is protected, often they're hit by cars, they fall victim to disease, starvation, poisons, attacks by other animals, or mistreatments by humans. When you protect the cat, you protect the public health. There are humane alternatives to TNR, like increased adoption. We have many agencies in our community that try to adopt cats out. Widespread low-cost spay and neuter and vaccination clinics. In some parts of the country, there are enclosed cat sanctuaries where unadoptable cats are safe and unable to commingle with native wildlife, including prey species. These kind of sanctuaries are very difficult to achieve. They must be highly regulated, have strict veterinary medical direction, and both animal control and health department approval on plans and oversight. And what we're talking about is prevention, much in that same way in the 60s and 70s when people didn't let their dogs outside, when they let their dogs outside, and now they don't do that anymore, and you've seen a reduction in canine rabies. We want to see prevention, to teach new behaviors, to value cats as indoor pets. And so there are safe solutions for cats. You can look at things like these are just 2 examples of companies like Catio Spaces, where you're putting in a little door for your cat to go out on a little patio where they're enclosed and safe from being attacked from other animals. There are freestanding enclosures. I know my own cat wanders on our deck in an enclosed screen enclosure, but would be panicked if he was outside that screen enclosure. The picture on the bottom with the black fencing that arches over, that keeps that cat from wandering outside that fencing. And just to touch on our legal authorities, I'm not going to belabor this slide. Both Chapter 381, 386, and 64D3 gives us our authority. And then I wanted to have Chief Stone be able to speak to the legal authorities for animal control.
Welcome, Chief.
Good morning all. Tad Stone, Director, Department of Emergency Services, Fire Department, Animal Control, a few other things. First I'd like to start out by, because of our staffing challenges, we are a complaint-driven organization. We do not have the manpower or the resources to surveil an area to determine whether or not a colony is there, and those types of things. We are complaint-driven. And when we get tied into it, we deal with the county's code, Chapter 302, which is the Animal Control Ordinance, and that is the ordinance that we follow. The things that we get brought into are issues of abandonment, which clearly meet the definition which is inside of our code, animal cruelty charges and complaints in that area. But the biggest driving issue is the public nuisance issue, and those are the types of complaints that we get most of all. And what we continuously deal with in the field is, number one, a colony may be established in the wrong area if they're established at all. A lot of times a leasee of a commercial property may give permission for somebody to have cats in the back of the property, but the owner of the property does not agree with that. So when we contact the owner, he says, no, please take care of the problem for us. The areas that give us the biggest concern and the ones that we get the frequent complaints are parks, county parks, where open feeding takes place on those parks, and sometimes those take place on top of picnic tables and those types of things throughout the area. The most recent one that we had that caused a great deal of concern for me and my crews in animal services was a problem that we had at a medical facility. It was a cancer oncology center. We already have people in that area coming in a weakened immune system, and then we have feral cats that are working that are behind that facility. So that created some issues for us. In the way our current code is written, when an animal goes off of their property onto somebody else's property, and they don't have permission to be there by the owner of that other property, that is considered a nuisance animal for us. We're also involved in the rabies and licensing side of it, the rabies vaccination side of it. Our code requires after 4 months they get the initial inoculation for rabies, and then 1 year after that they get the so-called booster or the additional rabies vaccination. That really does not happen within a feral cat community or TNRV community. As Miranda mentioned, they're trap shy. It's difficult for them to be caught again, revaccinated, and released back into the community. So we are on the enforcement side of it. by the rabies compendium. We work very closely with the health department. And once again, we are complaint driven across the board. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have for what we do in the field.
Chief, the only question I had, looking at those maps that Miranda showed, you know, you had pretty high densities of captures in Gifford, South County, Vero Beach area, but the two Sebastian maps were really kind of startling the low numbers. Is there any reason for that, or?
No, sir. Once again, we're complaint driven, so we just haven't got the level of complaints and the level of turn-ins throughout that area up in Sebastian.
Okay, interesting. Commissioners, any other thing for Chief? Or Miranda, I guess, at this point?
Yes, for Miranda?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned toxoplasmosis as a strong concern, and coupled with the fact of the habits of the creatures, is there a vaccine, a long-lasting vaccine, or some sort of element that could be taken, like a prophylaxis, to prevent the contamination from spreading to humans?
No, there's no vaccine for toxo, and similar to, you always hear the recommendation for pregnant women not to change the litter box for their cats, but there is a pervasive risk as well from toxo aside from that. But no, there isn't a vaccine for that, and usually, no, there's not.
You
I mean,
mentioned,
Barb, do you have anything to add to that?
I saw the nod on that. I guess total agreement. The other concern I had was you mentioned areas like soft, loamy, sandy soil where cats prefer to leave their fertilizer, and that's a known fact. You know, looking at the maps, and I'm looking at what the citizens do in their backyards. They grow tomatoes, vegetables, and as I do. I have them caged and contained because I don't want creatures getting in there and stealing my fruit. But I also did that because I had a few, you mentioned Sebastian, I did have a few cats that preferred the site. And you know very quickly if they prefer your site. They leave a strong scent. So if that's the case, is that a concern? Could it get into the food chain in that manner? Could it grow into? Is it systemic? Or do we have to be eating something that we've touched the fecal matter?
So it's a fecal oral route of transmission, and perhaps Cheryl or Barb, I'd let you answer that question.
Because what Tony Brown mentioned is very strong, being familiar with a lot of the yards in the area. There's a lot of people that do grow vegetables to offset their food costs. Tremendous amount.
The answer to your question is yes, toxoplasmosis, you don't hear about it a lot, but it is, it's a very important foodborne disease. You don't hear about it so much because people don't get acutely ill with it like they do with salmonella or any of the other foodborne illnesses. But it insists and it lays dormant. So, but it's a very important one. You just don't hear a lot about it.
So if someone was feeding cats that had a little clipped ear, it would have no impact on these concerns. And there are many others, Doc.
So what I can tell you is that TNVR doesn't solve any of the other public health concerns that we have.
Thank you.
Thank you
Mr.
very
Chairman.
much for the opportunity to present to you. And, you know, we've been looked at in Indian River in terms of a model for providing education about free roaming cats to the Department of Health. It is a tough issue to educate on. We've certainly shared the materials that we've used in terms of education with other counties because it's important that people understand the facts. And the tagline really that we've used is what's good for the cat is good for the public health. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We had moved up a public discussion item. I got Freddie. 10B1, a request to speak from Dr. David Cox, Audubon, Florida, and Pelican Island Audubon Society regarding trap, neuter, and reabandon. And then after Dr. Cox speaks, if there's anyone else in the audience that wishes to speak, we'll hear them at that time. Dr. Cox, welcome.
Thank you, Peter. Commissioners, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is David Cox. I live on Periwinkle Drive in Summer Place. And if you have any questions as I'm going, please just interrupt. And I'm not going to speak to the same issues that you've heard Miranda speaking about, primarily disease-related and public health. I'm going to be talking from a different perspective. Today I represent the board and about 70,000 members of Audubon, Florida, as well as the board and about 900 members of our local Audubon chapter, Pelican Island Audubon. I wanted to briefly mention what our missions are. Audubon, Florida, using science to guide our priorities and BirdLife to measure ecosystem health. Audubon advocates for the protection of land, water, and wildlife, and has for 115 years been the voice of wildlife conservation. Pelican Island has a somewhat longer mission statement to preserve and protect the animals, plants, and natural communities and the land and water on which they depend in Indian River County through education, advocacy, and public awareness. At the local, state, and even national levels, Audubon speaks with one voice on the issue of free-ranging domestic cats and TNR or TNVR programs. And that one voice speaks for all birds and other wildlife endangered by these cats. Our position on free-ranging cats or free-roaming cats is simple. We recognize that domestic cats provide many benefits to people, including companionship and comfort. And I should mention that I'm not sure that I've ever been without a cat in my house. And I currently have a stray cat that we took in and who has now been living with us for the past 2 years. We also recognize that free-ranging, that is feral, stray, and outdoor-owned cats, kill literally billions of birds and small mammals in the United States each year. Audubon supports responsible pet ownership to keep domestic cats indoors or controlled on leash, like dogs, and to manage feral cat overpopulation by establishing alternatives to feral cat colonies. What leads us to our position is also simple. The domestic cat is an exotic invasive species brought to North America by colonists and is now more abundant than any native carnivore. The plus or minus 140 million domestic cats in the United States annually kill 1.3 to 4 billion birds and between 6 and 22 million small mammals. Now this is, and I should also mention, I have references that I'm happy to provide you for any of these estimates. There's a broad scientific consensus that cats are the top source of direct human-caused mortality for birds and small mammals in the United States, and thus disrupt native ecosystems. They do not balance native ecosystems. Cats are instinctive hunters. They hunt to kill whether they are fed or not. Outdoor domestic cats and feral and stray cats prey upon native birds, small mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and even insects. If it moves and it interests them, they will play with it and attack it. I should also mention that they not only kill native animals, but they also maim and dismember and gut and leave for dead countless other animals. And as you've heard, the cats are vectors of diseases that can affect humans and other pets and, of course, wildlife. The lives that outdoor cats live are far shorter than indoor cats, and they're far more challenging and brutal. They're exposed to many risks, diseases, certainly among them, automobiles, larger predators, etc. Now, in Indian River County, as you've heard, the number of free-ranging domestic cats is estimated to be about 55,000. These cats kill between almost 500,000 and 1.5 million birds per year, and between 2.4, call it, and 8.5 million small mammals in Indian River County. Many of these victims will have lived, as you've heard, in public parks, also in conservation areas, and in a variety of vacant green spaces. Our conservation areas and green spaces are islands in a sea of urban development. And whenever cats are introduced to islands, they cause extinctions. Now, I want to revisit just 3 of the maps that Miranda shared with you earlier, but look at them from a slightly different perspective. First, at the county level, again, the hot spots of outdoor cat captures occur in our challenged, underserved communities, often near vacant or publicly owned lands or dumpsters. And I want to return to Sebastian, where we've had some questions. And looking at what we call here Sebastian South, I want to call your attention to the lower right corner of that image, to the Wabasso Scrub Conservation Area, which is the kind of green space. Do I have a pointer? Okay. There it is, right there. And there's a cluster of captures that are around that area. And that's 111 acres of conservation land that was purchased with taxpayer funds to protect an island of endangered scrub. And it was purchased especially to protect Florida scrub jays, an endangered species that, owing to its nesting preferences, that is, the kind of oak trees that occur in scrub are maybe high. And the birds nest like at about my height.
David, keep the mic.
Oh, the birds nest 5 to 7 feet off the ground. So they're especially vulnerable to attack by domestic cats. And so we've invested heavily in these lands, and our investment is vulnerable. In fact, all of our county conservation lands, and you can see several of them sprinkled around here, are islands in a growing sea of humanity. And in every case I know of, whenever cats, as I've said, are introduced to islands, extinction of native species follows. The final example I want to show is that Sebastian North and captures around the North Sebastian Conservation Area. There are several of them that are adjacent to the conservation area. And again, this was a conservation area that was established to protect the endangered scrub species, especially scrub jays, gopher tortoises, gopher frogs, etc. And I think it's interesting in looking at This image, and if you can recall all the others, we don't see any of these symbols, any of the red dots or triangles or diamonds inside the conservation areas. They're not complaints coming from inside the conservation areas. It seems reasonable to expect, given how large these conservation areas are, that free-ranging cats will be present in these areas. And if they're present, they will be preying on wildlife. Our county taxpayers have partnered with taxpayers from across the state to buy and protect these lands and their wildlife. These public investments are very likely being diminished by outdoor domestic cats. In conclusion, the recommendations of Audubon, Florida, and Pelican Island Audubon are the following. We support efforts to educate and encourage cat owners to keep cats indoors or controlled on leashes when outdoors, and to have their pets spayed or neutered. We support the humane reduction of feral cat colonies. We support this passage and enforcement of state legislation and local ordinances prohibiting establishment of feral cat colonies and the release or an abandonment of feral or unwanted cats outdoors. We oppose the passage of state legislation and local ordinances that condone or legalize the deliberate establishment of feral cat colonies. And to summarize, trap, neuter, reabandonment appears advantageous to one and only one species, introduced exotic cats, and harmful to many dozens, perhaps hundreds of other species. To protect our threatened wildlife, we must humanely remove domestic cats from the landscape. Thank you again, Commissioners, for your time, and I will entertain any questions if you have them. Thank you.
Commissioners, any questions?
No, it's very straightforward.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else in the audience that wishes to speak on this? Good morning, welcome, Freddie.
Good morning. Got a half a voice this morning. Got a little laryngitis, but I'm here. Freddie Woolfolk, 4590 57th Avenue. I'm here to just shine a little light on the cat infestation that we have in the Gifford area. It's not by accident that those cats are in that area. There's such a certain cultural way of life that I've known all of my life. And if it weren't for Ms. Miranda Hawker and me serving on the Gifford Health Council, I would not have been educated to understand why that has transpired. What I mean is, when I was a kid, my mom used to tell me, don't bother that cat. I thought it was just not want me to hurt the cat. She said, the cat is good luck. And that's a myth in our neighborhood. They say a cat is good luck, so leave the cat. So what do I have in my yard? A couple of roaming cats. And my wife said, we need to get the Humane Society out here to get rid of these cats. I said, no, that's good luck. That was before I heard the pamphlet was passed out at the Gifford Health Council that we really, really need to educate people in River County that they may be nice little furry animals that we love, but they're not good luck when it comes to our health. So we are asking that we continue to support the health department, Ms. Hawker and her staff, in helping to educate. Educate is going to be the key, because I never thought about that animal in my yard being a furry, beautiful little cat, but what about the food that someone had fed that cat and he had to fight for the food against a rabid raccoon, was bitten with rabies. Now I'm thinking it's just a pretty little cat. Go out and rub it and it bites me, and I'm wondering what's going on when I'm having these hickeys all over my head. Little cat. But so I support, is serving with the Gifford Health Council and working alongside of the Indian River County Health Department. We really got to educate people that they are furry, nice little animals, but we make sure that they were kept inside, neutered, or in some way controlled as far as roaming cats in our county. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Freddie. Is there anyone else that wishes to comment? I'd like to thank Miranda and your staff for the presentation, and Chief Stone, Dr. Cox, and Freddie. Thank you all for your input. We appreciate it. Thank you. Commissioners, we move on to the approval of the minutes, regular meeting of September 11 and September 18.
Second.
We have a motion from Commissioner Adams, second by Commissioner Zork for both minutes. Any discussion? All in favor signify with aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That carries 5-0. Informational items, Commissioner, any comment on informational items? Hearing none, we move to the consent agenda. Commissioners, does anyone wish to pull an item for additional discussion? Hearing none, is there anyone from the audience that wishes to have a consent agenda item pulled for additional discussion? Seeing none,
Move approval.
Second.
we have a motion from Commissioner Flesher, second by Commissioner Zork. All in favor signify with aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That carries 5-0. We've completed the public discussion item. Jason, we still have a couple minutes left, so we'll go ahead to your items. The collective bargaining agreement between Indian River County and IAFF Local 2201 on the fiscal year 1819 general wage increase.
Sure, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. We have before you today the collective bargaining agreement between the county and the International Association of Firefighters Local 2201. As you know, we're in the